talk about making this real. So this is the model that we're talking about. And the evolution of this model starts with channel data. And the concept is that you would use NoSQL and a knowledge graph to bring in channel data of structured, unstructured data, and that would basically filter into a network design layer where we're not talking about an ad hoc network design. We're talking about the design of flow on a regular basis, which would flow into the orange layer where we're talking about self-directed work. And what I would really love to have is for the technologists to build this orange layer. So the concept of the orange layer is that business leaders can get to planning data. So in demand visibility, you would have the ability to collaborate on shifting versus shaping, to see demand latency, to be able to look at what is happening on the bullwhip effect and collaborate on things like, should we do this promotion, based upon effectiveness? And this would replace what most people have as revenue management. Then the concept of bidirectional orchestration would allow the business leaders, not just the planners, to agree on what levers should be set in place to be pulled in S&OP, because unless you decide you want to do it, you can't just add suppliers. You've got to qualify them and bring them on. You can't just change transportation lanes. You've got to negotiate with transportation. And then the supply visibility layer is sensing off a supply, looking at Internet of Things data. So things like arrival times or changes in lead time or tank levels of what's happening or weather or quality sensing, and looking at pattern recognition, perhaps on quality effectiveness. And so this orange layer is a new technology layer that doesn't exist yet, but one that I'm trying to get the technologists to build. We aren't too far away with a couple of technologists, but we're still not there. Then the baseline demand is, what would you sell if you did no demand shaping? There are only two tools in the market that I think are good at telling me baseline demand, but it isn't real clear to a business user of how to do that. And then plan feasibility of, do I have a good plan, based upon what I was trying to do in the last period. That orange layer, which would be used by the business leaders prior to S&OP, would set up the levers to be pulled in S&OP, and the blue layer is where our conventional planners sit. My goal is that the blue layer becomes more of an orchestration lever and we can reduce planners. I would like to get away from hundreds and thousands of planners, which is very ineffective, and allow us to really orchestrate and derive better answers and redefine that blue layer as well to make it much more role-based and much more effective. And then the rules automation and the policy automation comes from the ontological layer, which allows us to automate rules. So it starts with a series of truths in the ontology about which customers should get which products and why, and requires the need for a real-time perpetual inventory signal. Now, this planning master data layer is basically taking all of the supply data and looking at things like lead time and commodity shifts and conversion rates over time. And this planning master data layer is informing the engines. So today, you've got, the potential for new applications, the areas in gray you can buy today: the planning master data layer, the unified data model, the form and function of inventory, S&OP execution, and the knowledge graph. You can't buy it from any one vendor, but there are pieces of it. And, in a couple of months, I will write an overview report of where the market is against this platform concept. We do not have market-driven demand management or demand visibility or the procurement buyer workbench, revenue management, bidirectional orchestration, or self-directed planning at this point in time. So that's where we're at. And then just to recap, these are the bidirectional orchestration levers. When you did your homework, were these easy, or did you struggle with this at all, or does this make sense? The bidirectional orchestration levers? Because you would set the bidirectional orchestration levers into the framework based upon the planning horizons. What makes sense at the longer term horizon, what makes sense, in the tactical horizon outside of manufacturing lead time, what makes sense in the operational horizon, and what makes sense in the executional horizon. Does that make sense? Questions about this? Okay, which gets us to our maturity model, which is going to be the basis of what we're going to start with today, right? So how do you take all this, and since the technologists aren't there and it's conceptual and it's a bit academic, how do you go from where we're at to really drive progress? So the first thing is organizational learning, to find the balanced scorecard, and hopefully you can use the work I am doing with Georgia Tech to inform your organization. We should have 20 balanced scorecards by industry done by September. So if you're in an industry where we haven't done a balanced scorecard yet, you can bring that back to your industry and use your network design tools to really optimize against that balanced scorecard. Get to be good friends with the people that are doing network design work and higher level modeling on the graph, if you've got it, and build a knowledge graph against the balanced scorecard. On demand, move from a focus on error to forecast value add, get really good at the naive. Look at those demand streams, look at how do you build proxy naive forecasts for things like seasonal demand. Determine your baseline demand. What is the market potential? Look at, what data do you have? If you remember Margot talking about, she was surprised to find out how much data that she had and wasn't used. And again, Margot said that in the Nestle analytics area. Then define forecastability and map those demand streams, sort of like I had you do in the homework exercise. And then look at how do you tie bidirectional orchestration to the demand streams, educate the organization, and analyze your inventory effectiveness. And the way you analyze your inventory effectiveness is take the demand stream and look at the waste in that demand stream. So look at obsolescence, do a Pareto about those items in each demand stream that just aren't moving, that have very low inventory turns or obsolescence, and it will help you to look at the health of the inventory by demand stream and start to create awareness. So bring this back, and the way you bring it back is to talk about the so what, who cares. So use FVA or forecast value add and look at, what you're doing now versus maybe what you're doing on weighted MAPE or, focus on error, and take the insight into a network design model and dollarize it, right? So if we can prove the forecast value add, then that's worth this cost and this inventory level to our organization. Dollarize it. Try to get it out of the academic world. Look at the process of the demand and how you're making improvements or reducing the effectiveness of demand. One of the issues that we've had in the last decade is we've moved into consensus demand planning and consensus S&OP, which is reducing the effectiveness of the demand plan versus just holding ourselves accountable to the naive forecast. So the first step is organizational learning. The second is really defining what is value, right? Focus on how do you change your metrics hierarchy to the balanced scorecard, focusing the functions on reliability. So move from manufacturing cost and OEE in manufacturing to schedule adherence, first pass yield, and operating margin, and make that shift in manufacturing. You've got to make that shift in manufacturing or you'll never be able to balance inventory. Measure your demand shaping versus shifting effectiveness and dollarize the impact of shifting. Most companies are in a very bad habit of shifting versus shaping, and they're not dollarizing what the impact of that is. Calculate the demand latency and help the organization understand how off the order signal is by demand stream. You'll find that your distributors cause more turbulence, the small channels cause more turbulence, and help people to see that. Build a future state of the river. Maybe you do a strategy day, or you have, work after you've done the learning about what could this look like. Build your planning master data layer, that supply layer where you're looking at lead times, variation, and pump that into your current engines. You can do that without doing a seismic change. And then, define value and educate. So let's just take those first two levels of the maturity model. What do you think about those? Are those doable, or do you need more help or understanding to get that done? Suzette, does that make sense?
Yes, I have a quick question before we move forward. You mentioned that so yeah, companies tend more to shift rather than shaping, and they don't measure that cost.
Right.
What is the most effective way to measure that? Because I do agree, and there's a cost implicated, but nobody really knows like the size. What would be with data the best way to show? Yeah, this is a million, like over a period of a month. Like this shaping is just about like 400,000 putting in marketing effort.
Yep. So do you have a revenue management tool that helps you to look at lift, baseline lift?
Hmm.
Then what you would do is you'd calculate baseline, and you would look at each of your demand shaping campaigns and if they're lifting demand or not, and what the cost of that is. Now, what you're going to find, Suzette, is that on average, it takes 4 weeks to measure promotion effectiveness, and only 50% of promotions are ever measured. And it's kind of a landmine because sales doesn't necessarily want them to be measured, because sales is incented on volume. But that's how you do it. You go to the people that are working on revenue management, have the revenue management tools, and you look at each of your trade deals or price deals, and you say, did that lift demand off a baseline or not? And what was our cost to do that? And then when you get into shifting, you're going to have to look at the operational costs to basically add volume, rush trucks, all the things you have to do to, basically meet that higher demand.
Yeah,
Next,
yeah, no, perfect. Yeah, thanks for the answer. For the operational costs, is there a framework that you recommend to use, or we just like try to track it, like trucks plus overtime plus this? Because I think that that's a craziness that nobody really wants to take the or
yeah.
put the effort on.
Now you've almost got to do like an organizational tracking to have them
Okay.
track what it is.
Okay.
Nestor, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, Laura, I wonder if you could maybe explain a little more the stage two supply bullet points. Will that be, you're using this data that you created on, the river of demand to implement this into a downstream of the different channels or the different operational functions, or how does that, what does that point?
Yeah, so I'm going to just skip ahead to a model that I'm going to come back to. So I'm going to take you, Nestor, to here, right? So those first two columns of the maturity model are really into what you can build of what you can control. So you can learn and you can educate the organization. You want to use those to influence the education. And the way you influence is you share articles, you dollarize the value, you socialize with people that you trust, you try to build a guiding coalition. You don't run out and buy technology. You're really working on socializing the concepts and building a guiding coalition within the organization. So You'd want to get close to the people that are doing revenue management. You'd want to get close to the people doing network design. You'd want to get close to people that are leaders in demand planning. What you don't want to do is get into what I'm going to call the circle concern. So the circle concern is where you have not built a bridge or not built the influence in the organization to go there. So for example, if you calculated FVA and you found out that you have serious deterioration in your forecast, you need to be really careful if you're not in the demand planning group, because they're going to say, does Nestor think we're all stupid? What is this FVA model, right? You'd want to have a one-on-one luncheon with maybe, a person you trust in the demand team and say, I've learned this technique. Have you read about forecast value add? I want to just give you some insight. You want to build that. You don't want to, go swinging your bat in areas where, you haven't built the reason to be. And let me tell you, as a gal that's not always an easy learner, I have learned this the hard way. Build your influence before you try to change the organization. Don't go swinging after technology. So one of the classes that I taught in Europe about 6 months ago, I had a person from Corning that really wanted to have a different technology. And the IT group was really pushing SAP HANA, and he didn't believe in SAP HANA. And I'm like, I don't care what you believe. At this point in time, you have not earned the right to have that discussion. Build what you can control, get really good at your job, start the influence, help the organization to see a bigger path, and then have the larger organization have the discussion about technology. So this is the model we're going to talk about today. And as we build that and we think about design thinking, which is what we're going to talk about next, we really want to understand what the roles need, right? And so, we talk about demand, but just like Margot did some role-based definition, you want to map what those roles need before you ever start to think about technology. You don't really want to engage with technologists until you're into stage 3, which is testing a new planning taxonomy. And here you really have got to have built that guiding coalition within the organization with a very clear definition of what a good plan is and what that data is before you ever get into this discussion, and then start to talk about how you can automate. And when you do that, you got to be really clear on what are your definitions? What is a bidirectional lever? What is a knowledge graph? How would you use NoSQL? What are the rules and how would you have the rules? And then how would you use the bidirectional orchestration levers? And I got to tell you, one of my big learnings is that the definitional detail that a technologist needs is usually beyond the thinking of the average person in business, right? So when I worked for Dreyer's Grand Ice Cream, I built production planning on a spreadsheet, and I thought I really understood planning. And then I went to a company called Manugistics as a product leader and product management, and I had to help the R&D folks code. And I really realized that my level of definition was not nearly detailed enough for the people that need to code. So you've got to get really clear on your definitions. And then as you evolve out of those pilots, right, like Margot, right, is in this stage where she has a new taxonomy. She really wants Nestle to test. She's bringing people into these classes. You've got to test and learn, and then you'll evolve and redefine work. And you need to start this evolution with the focus on redefining work from the very beginning. So, you need to have business leaders, talk about how will they use planning, because, as we get the planners to actually change their jobs and we have self-directed planning, we need to really evolve in how we do work. And so the analogy of the secretarial pool, which is what I wrote about on LinkedIn last week, I think the planners are an obstacle today because they're very set in their ways of they manipulate data and then they dish it out to the business leaders. So the concept of self-directed planning may be threatening to them. And what you've got to do is help them to see it as an opportunity for maybe growth or, redefining their roles. So this is the evolution. Right now, I think we're in level 1 and level 2, and hopefully the technologist will mature their applications so that stage 3 can be easier. Does that help you, Nestor?
Yeah, that helps. Thank you, Laura.
What speaks to you in that discussion?
So especially that's the part of like creating the flow of the metrics to the data to the action plan to the culture change. I work on this transformation projects of demand planning specifically, and there is always that gap between you may create the data layer that you discuss that uses all these external signals to try and shape the demand, or at least like know what are the factors that influence the demand, but then how do you translate that into the individual products that are shifted and shaped by the business units and by the demand planners, and they don't really correlate to what we are seeing in the raw demand from the customer, right? So I think that this flow of like taking it step by step, it really goes it's really well explained, but I think it's difficult from both sides of like maybe from the data analyst transformation office side that just wants to get the product as soon as possible, and the IBP team or business unit teams that just wants to get again something that doesn't disrupt their work that much, but automatically makes it much better, which is almost impossible to get.
Well, the other thing is, never let a good crisis go to waste.
Yeah.
So if you've got something that's happened in the organization, draw the river of demand and give them data around how rethinking demand flows could help. Never let a good crisis go to waste in building that whole influence management.
Yeah.
So as we think about the maturity model, I want us to invest time in thinking about design thinking. Has anybody studied design thinking? Because many times people want to look at the as is, the to be state, and jump into implementing technology. And I worked with a large food manufacturer that was actually testing and learning, and they invested in design thinking. And it's a very different process because what you're doing is you're starting on inspiration and ideation before you ever get to implementation. And so I think people rush to implementation too early. If we think about design thinking, about first understanding how do people need to use data, observing people, grokking people, right? Looking at, how do they make decisions? Like when I go into organizations, one of the first thing I find out is how many hours do planners spend in meetings? How effective are those meetings? And then, you ideate before you ever prototype, and, you brainstorm, on what this could look like. And then, you've got a lot of false starts, and failure is good. Failure is learning, right? I laugh that everybody wants me to write case studies about, success, but the biggest case study learning comes from failure, right? When I tell you stories like P&G screwed up in the acquisition of Gillette, you'll remember that longer than you may remember a success story. So start with the market understanding and, work on it. So I don't know if you realize this, but I forced Nestle and OMP to do design thinking in that case study that Margot shared with you. So OMP had gone through the Spark training. Nestle had gone through the Spark training. And the first thing I wanted to do was get data and implement a pilot. And I said, no, that's not what we're going to do. And I was heavy-handed in it. I mean, I forced them to do it to the point where they didn't want to talk to me for a couple of weeks. And so I said, you've got to do a role-based discovery on how people use demand data in the commercial teams and what demand means, and how people use demand data in the supply side and what demand means, and build this role-based storyboard to understand what this looks like. And I actually wrote the first set of questions here for Margot, and she was like, I just don't have time to do this. I just need to get the data and, get on with this. And OMP was like, you got to understand, we got this conference coming up. I don't have time to it. I said, you have to do this. You will never be effective on building this river of demand unless you take the business problem and you take the roles and you find out the questions that they're trying to answer with the data, and you look at the systems and the current fit versus what they need and look at it by role. And that was kind of the aha moment, if you remember, for Margot, where I also forced her to build this model, which looked at latency and socialize this model with all the roles in her organization, which was an aha moment because she built this team to basically look at, what did they need on those screens. Now, she wasn't working with real data. She wasn't working with real technology. I mean, in terms of, she was working with visual analytics, to basically build some sample screens. But she was looking at the differences by role, because we do not have tools today that allow demand translation across the river demand. There are no good tools. Most people that are in the supply chain world are very fixated on a supply-centric demand view. They don't understand necessarily what's needed by finance or the general manager. And so this design thinking, where we start with, what are the questions they're trying to answer? What is the work? What could the work look like is the important thing that we need to work on, not necessarily rush out and buy technology. And, the variability side of this, when we forced LKQ to basically track their variability. And if you remember when Nicole said, her boss said, are you trying to say we're stupid, Nicole? You've got to build that kind of understanding that says it's okay that we failed. It's okay that we learned. And if you don't create that we're going to learn together kind of attitude, it's really hard to be successful. When you uncover these cracks, whether it's the supply variability, which is usually much more extreme in an organization than they realize, or the forecast value add, which is typically much more extreme than they realize, or the forecast stability, people don't feel good about that process. And somehow you have to help them to feel good that we're learning together. And that takes really influence management with leadership. And so my advice is start with the roles, identify the problem in the eyes of each role, do that question grid, build a storyboard. So the river of demand is a way of building a storyboard so that you can go back and you can say, I've interviewed everyone, and this is what the current river looks like, and this is what the future river could look like. And then test and learn with technologies and, work with technologists to be able to do this and define the process. But as you do this, don't expect immediate ROI. Don't go into this with the typical project of, I'm going to save X amount of dollars in X number of years. Work on it as a redefinition of work and workflow, and then evolve and measure and define the process. Don't let a good crisis go to waste. Every time you've got a big miss in your operation, use it as an opportunity to come back and to build the influence to think differently, right? Share articles, participate in pilots, host lunch and learn sessions, share webinars, and help people to define what does good look like, what is a good plan, ask for definition. And then get really good at your job and, measure and help people to learn and grow. This model is a very important model, I think. So, back when, I first started in industry, I got in trouble because I would always get into my circle of concern. I'm a Myers-Briggs INFP, and so I always would be looking forward. And my boss drew this drawing on my desk and said, "You're here, Lora, work on your circle of control, work on your circle of influence. Your circle of influence doesn't happen by just working hard. Get good at telling stories. Get good at helping people to bridge differences. Get good at diffusing situations with laughter. And then build your circle of influence so you can drive change."